What's up, guys? Welcome to the Software Engineering channel. This is the part 2 of our JavaScript Zero to Master course. And in this part, we're going to be talking about variables and data types. Let's dive right in, guys. Now, when we talk about variables basically in JavaScript and in other programming language as well, they share the same concept. It's basically a container that stores value. You want to picture your Amazon warehouse when your package or whatever it is you're ordering for gets packed into a box. You want to see that box as a variable. Variable itself is not the value. The value is inside of the box, right? But that box is like a reference. If you want to access the item inside the box, you have to go through taking that box and pulling it out, right? So it's basically a reference. That's what a variable is. It is basically a container that helps you store a value so you can reference it and use it later in the course of your program execution. Now, when we talk about declaring a variable, there are basically two ways you can declare a variable. You can use your let's keyword to declare your variable, and you can use your const keyword to declare variables. Now we're going to be looking deeply into the differences between these two. Both of them are legit ways in which you can declare your variables. In using your let's keyword, variables can be reassigned with new values. What that means is if you declare your variable using your let's keyword, it simply means you can reassign that variable with a value. That's what it means. Let's see what that means in our code detail. So I'm currently in our code editor, and we are going to I created a script already called variable.js. I'm going to close up this script. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to close up my tab, close this up. We have to link our script into our HTML for it to work. So I'm going to do this. If you do not understand how this is done, please, I would advise that you take a look at the last part of this particular series. That's the first part, rather, where we spoke extensively about identifiers. There, I explained the reason why we had to do this. All right, so I said when you're using your let keyword to declare a variable, it can be reassigned in the course of your program execution. So let's say, for example, I want to declare a variable called name, and I'm assigning this variable with a name called Dami_Alagbala. Now, if I do a console.log on this variable called name, and don't mind that, that's just JavaScript. That's just my code editor playing with me. So let's simply do my name. Beautiful. Okay, so let's save this. Let's clear up our console and do a refresh. Now you can see that Dami Alagbala. So that is my variable being printed out. Now, let is used so that you can reassign, you're able to reassign another value to that variable. So if, for example, during the course of my program execution, I notice that at this point, I do not have to put another let to my variable because it has been declared already. This is the declaration process. So now all I have to do is just simply use, right? I can simply use. So let's say I want to change this name to my full name. I want to change this to my full name and also do a console.log on that same variable. Now let's refresh, and now you would notice that on variable.js on line 3, which is this line, we got Dami Alagbala, and that's because my name at this point, this variable has this value called Dami Alagbala, right? And going down to line 5, we're able to reassign another value into this name, right? And the reason why we are able to do this, and that's why we have it printed here, the reason why we are able to do this is because we declared this variable using the let keyword. The let keyword can allow you to reassign values to a variable. Now let's look at const. Using const, you cannot reassign a new value to a particular variable. You cannot reassign a new value to a particular variable. Let's see how that works in Visual Studio Code. Now, let's say we declare a variable with const with accounts, and you can see our camel casing here. If you do not understand the reason why I'm doing this, whereby I'm joining two words together and I'm using the first letter, the capital letter, this is called camel casing. If you do not understand the concept of camel casing, please check out the previous video. Now let's do a console.log on Twitter account. Let's comment this out. We are done with that. Let's do a console.log on Twitter account. Just like every other variable, you can have the value of the variable printed out. Now let's try to reassign. Let's try to reassign a value to Twitter account. And now let's also try to print it out. The same thing we did in the first case, which is alert. Let's try to print this out and let's refresh. So now you see that JavaScript is showing us an error. And if you read the error message, it says assignment to constant variable. That's an error, right? So that's JavaScript telling you that you cannot assign, you cannot reassign to a constant variable. Assignment to constant variable is done just once, and that is what we've done here. So you cannot reassign a value to a constant variable, and that's what JavaScript is telling us. You cannot reassign a value to a constant variable. So when you declare a variable using the let keyword, you can change the value inside of it. But when you declare a variable with a const keyword, you cannot reassign the value. You cannot change whatever it carries, basically. Variables can be declared and subsequently initialized. Now, when you declare a variable with let keyword, you can declare the variable and then initialize the variable. There's a difference between declaration and initialization. Let's see the difference between declaration and initialization. Now, declaration simply means you're making the variable known to the program. That's basically what it means. You're necessarily not attaching a value to the variable. You're simply creating a space in your computer memory, and you are tagging that space with your variable name. That's what it means. So when you do, I can say let my name. That's allowed, right? Okay, let me just leave this way so that you have access to it and it's not mutilated. I'll just do this in another line. So I can say let user cat. Now this is allowed. This is what we call declaration. At this point, you'll notice that we are not assigning any value to user cat. We are simply declaring. That's what we're doing alone. We are not assigning, we're simply declaring. This is called declaration. Now, when you say user cat equals to 5, this is what we call initialization. Now you are initializing user cat with a value called 5. You are assigning, basically, right? So the rule is saying when you're declaring a variable with let, you are allowed to declare the variable first and then initialize later, right? We are allowed to do this, but in const, you are not allowed to declare first and initialize later. Variable must be initialized at declaration time, right? Let's see how that works. So this is saying, so if I do a console.log, and don't worry about console.log, guys. Just keep it at the back of your mind that it is used to print out stuff from your scripts into your console. Don't worry about how it came to be. When we discuss function and we talk about classes as well, you would understand how this works. But for now, just see it as a printing tool. Let's print out a user cat, and now we have 5. Awesome. Now let's see in the area of const. So let's try to declare a constant and then try to initialize the constant later. That was the same thing we did 300 bucks. And now let's try to do a console.log on price tag. Let's save. You'll see an error here. Missing initializer in const declaration. And that makes a lot of sense. So what it's telling you is that we see that you're declaring a constant, but you are not initializing it with a value, right? Even if we eventually came down to initialize it, but the rule says you must initialize your constant variable during the same time as when you are declaring it. So that means the only way this can work is if I say equals to 300. So this way I'm initializing at the same time I'm declaring at my declaration time. Now let's do a refresh on this, and you see that works immediately. So that's the rule, guys. Don't forget it. When you're using a constant, you must initialize immediately at declaration time. But when you're using a let variable, you can subsequently initialize after declaration. Now, my rule of thumb, or a general rule of thumb, would be only use your let keyword when you are sure you want to reassign the variable. Most of the time, the cause and the reason of logic bug that programmers, especially newbies, encounter during creating applications in JavaScript is basically because of mistake in reassigning a value to a particular variable. They did not mean to, right? But because you're using your let keyword all over the place, you can mistakenly assign a variable into another. You can mistakenly assign a value into into a variable that you do not mean to, right? So the rule of thumb is declare your variable with const, except you are very sure the variable is going to need to be reassigned. An example is your user cart. The total number of item in your user cart is going to change. So that means if I'm declaring a variable as user cart, I want to declare it with the let keyword, because I know that this user cart is going to change over time. If I purchase a new item, this user cart would change and become 6. If I add 2 more items to the cart, this user cart is going to change and become 8. So I know that during the course of the execution of my program, user cart is going to change. And for that reason alone is why I'm going to initialize it using the let keyword. But for things like your price tag for a particular item is not going to change. For things like pi, let's use pi for an example. Pi is not going to change. Your pi is not going to change. So you don't want to use let as pi, because now you are subjecting this variable to change, and it's not supposed to change. It's supposed to be your 3.142 if I still remember mathematics, right? So but then if you declare this variable with let keyword, you can as well just reassign another thing to it, and this becomes a problem. But if you initialize this variable with a const keyword, you are sure that this is not going to work, and you are going to easily see an error, right? And it's going to be easily fixable. There are 3 types of error in JavaScript, and the most painful error is your logical error, because your program is going to be running quite alright, but you're not going to be getting the expected result. And this is one of the most prominent reasons for logical error. Let's stick to that. Use const often, except you are sure you need to reassign. That's the difference between your let and const. Don't forget, let and const are both used for declaring a variable, but there are differences, and I'm sure by now you understand when to use let and when to use const. So the question is, where does var comes in? If you are a bit experienced, you would have seen var used in JavaScript, and var is a popular way in declaring variables in JavaScript, but not until ES 2015, or ES 6. AS 2015 or AS6 is basically a version of JavaScript that was released in 2015. Before then, we use var to declare our variables, and that's why you see things like var user cards, var this, var that, var this, var that, right? It became a problem. There was a problem with scoping. I'm going to make a separate video on the difference between var and let. The idea of var also is so that you are able to reassign a value to your variable. I'm going to make a separate video analyzing and dissecting the difference between let and var. So yeah, please, when you're trying to declare a variable, do not use var. Avoid using var. Use your let when you need to use your let, and use const when you need to use your const. Let's look at data types in JavaScript. As the word implies, your data types is basically what the type of the value you're trying to store in a variable is. What's the type of the value you're storing in a variable? It's just the same way when you have a container. The container can contain a solid content. Your container can contain a liquid content. Your container can contain a semi-liquid content, a semi-solid content, right? It's the same way in JavaScript. So your variable can contain different types, and it is very important to understand these types because you're going to be working with them. So in JavaScript, variables are not assigned or attached to a type automatically. JavaScript is untyped, right? So what that means is you have to decide which type a variable is going to take. JavaScript also use what we call inference. I'm going to come to that, but let's look at the different types in JavaScript. We have primitive types and we have reference types. Your primitive types simply includes your numbers, it includes your strings, it includes your Boolean, and we also have special types called null and undefined. Right? Let's check how this works in JavaScript. Also, for some of you that are wondering what this means, let me just divert a little bit. This is simply called comments. So comments are simply line of code that are not executable. That's what comments is. So when you do this to your line of code and you save and you refresh, you would see that nothing happens. It's simply because you've commented out all of this line of code, and you do this by using your control / backslash, if I'm correct, right? So it renders the line of code useless basically. So that's what I'm doing. All right, let's go back to our data types. So we have numbers. So if I say let age equals to 24. Now, remember I said JavaScript is able to detect the type of a variable by using what we call inference. So if you hover on age, you would see that JavaScript is telling us that the data type of age is number. Now, the reason this is because JavaScript was smart enough to know that a number has been assigned to age. Therefore, age can be said to have a data type of number. That's basically what it is. And also we said we have number. Also, we said we have strings. Strings are basically characters, and strings are characterized by using an apostrophe. So whatever is within this apostrophe is characterized as a string, right? And whatever at all. So if I say John Doe, now let's hover on name. If you hover on name, you will see string. So that means JavaScript is saying that our variable name is of a type string. And I already told you how JavaScript is able to detect this. It's able to detect this because JavaScript was wise enough to notice that a string has been assigned to name. And also I said we have Booleans. Booleans are simply true or false values, right? So when we say let's correct equals to true, so it can be either true or false. So it can be either true or false. So if you hover on correct as well, you would see your Boolean value. So your Boolean can either be true or false. That's what we call Boolean. Now, speaking about our special types, null and undefined, these are also types in JavaScript, right? So if I say null, no value, and I assign it to a null. So basically what you are trying to do is you are telling JavaScript that I do not want to assign anything to this variable yet. That's what null means. And that's why when you hover on it, you will see that this variable is taking a type of any. It means this variable can be assigned can be initialized with any value, right? So I can say no value equals to 5. I can say no value equals to a string. I can say no value equals to false, right? So basically, you initialize a variable with null when you are unsure of what data type it is going to take in the course of your program execution, right? So that's what null means. And almost the same thing goes for undefined as well. I'm going to be making a short video, a short video explaining the difference between null and undefined. But for now, just see them as doing almost the same thing. So this is our primitive types in JavaScript. These are primitive types in JavaScript. Let's look at the next type in JavaScript. We have reference types as well. In our reference types, we have objects, we have arrays, we have functions. These are reference type, not primitive types now. We're going to take a very simple look at them. So let's look at functions. Let's at objects rather. An object in JavaScript is simply a data structure that is used to store related properties. Now, let's say, for example, we want to store a name of a person, say Dami, and we want to store the age of this person also. Let's say, for example, as well, we want to store color. Now, we are storing all of these different variables, different values in variables, right? So that we can have access to them. If you notice, all of this variable is speaking to a particular person, right? It's speaking to a person. If you notice, all of these are related properties of an entity, which is a person. Person must have a name. A person should have an age. A person should have a color, right? So instead of storing all of this in a separate variable, this is where object comes in. So we can easily store all of this in an object. So let's declare an object. Say let person equal to a curly braces. So this curly braces is what we use to initialize an object. By introducing this curly braces, you're telling JavaScript that this person is about to contain related properties, which makes it a candidate for an object. So you introduce your object using this curly brace, and your object takes what we call key value pairs. It means your object has a key and that key has a value. So in our case, our first key would be name, and the value of this name would be Dami. So this is what we call a key value pair. Name in this context is the key, while Dami is the value. Hence the word key value pair. So we can easily add another property to this to say age is 50, and we can easily say color, I'm unable to spell properly now, is black. Now, by doing this, we've been able to compress all of this property into one simple variable. So that means we can get rid of this. We don't need it because we have been able to store all of that information into a simple variable. And this is what we call an object. Now, if you hover on this, you'll see that our object contains some keys, which is the name, age, and color, right? So this is what we call an object. Now, let's talk about how to access our properties, our values in our object. So when you want to access the properties of your object or the values in your object, the same way you are able to come here and easily do a console.log name, right? You are able to access your name property and do a save on it and you have your dummy printed out, right? So in that same way, we want to access this dummy in our object. Now there are two ways you are able to access values in your objects. The first way is what we call your dot notation, using your dot notation. By default, dot notation should be your go-to pattern. So what your dot notation simply means is we can say person, which is our object, and introduce a dot. Now, immediately you introduce a dot, you are able to access all of the different properties within the person object, right? You are able to access your age, you are able to access color, and you're able to access the name. So in our case, we want to access the name. So let's do a console.log on this to see what we get. Okay, let's see, we have a little issue on line 63. Oh, sorry, my bad. Not a console.log. So let's save the changes and refresh. Voila. So we have dummy printed out. So you can see that now we are able to access the value of our name property in our person objects using our dot notation. In the same vein, we can access all other properties as well. We can also access the color. Let's save the changes and do a refresh. So we have dummy, we have 50, and we have black. Now all of this is in a property. So the advantage of this is basically organization, right? So you see that we are able to compress into one variable. We are able to compress all of its properties into that one variable, and that's the advantage of using an object. Now the second way of accessing properties within your objects is what we call the bracket notation. Bracket notation. In your bracket notation, the way you access properties is, as the name implies, you introduce a bracket, right? Close and open and close brackets, and you add the property that you want to access within the bracket. Don't mind this striking through. It's simply Visual Studio Code acting up. So now let's do a console.log on this. We're going to comment this out. Let's save the changes and refresh. Now, when you are using your bracket notation, whatever is within your bracket notation should be a string, right? So this tells JavaScript that we are trying to access the person property within this object. Look for a property that is called name within this object. Let's save the changes and run, and we have dummy. In the same manner, we can do a console.log on person and age. We can do a console.log of person on color. Don't forget, this cannot stand alone as a variable. And that was the reason why we had undefined the other time, because JavaScript was assuming that this was a variable, and it's not a variable, right? It's not a variable on its own. It has to be in a string, and that's the way you are able to access the properties, the value of these properties using your bracket notation. Let's do a refresh. Awesome. So that is how you are able to access your properties, the values within your properties within an object. Now the question that comes to mind is, what is the difference between your bracket notation and your dot notation? So basically, the difference between your bracket notation and your dot notation is the dynamism that your bracket notation gives you, right? But by default, you want to stick to dot notation, except if you are sure you need that dynamism, between your brackets and your dot notation. That's it about objects. Let's take a quick look at the next primitive type, which is arrays. Same as your objects, your array is a data structure. It's a data structure in JavaScript that is used to store list of data. And the way you initialize your array in let's say shopping item is using a bracket notation. This is how you initialize an array in JavaScript. You use a bracket notation. This tells JavaScript that you are about to store a list of items within this particular variable. And at the very core, an array is simply an object, actually, at the very core. But there is no need to go into that very details. Just have it at your back of your mind. At the back of your mind, that an array at the end of the day is really an object, right? But let's see them differently, just so you are able to understand the concept. Now, your array is able to store wide variety of stuff. Your array is able to store numbers, is able to store strings, is able to store objects, right? So I can initialize this with strings. I can say pepper. I can say plantain, PS Vita. Now this is the way you store items within your JavaScript array. I'm going to bring this down just so you are able to see properly. Now you can see the way I'm storing item in my JavaScript array. This is the way you store items in your array. Every item within your array has what we call an index. And in JavaScript, index starts from 0. So that means the first item has an index of what? The second item has an index of 1. And the third item has an index of 2. So let's print this out. Let's print this out. Console.log shopping item. And let's see what we have here. Now you can see this. This is our array in JavaScript. Now let's open this. So this is telling us that our array contains 3 items. Now when we open this array, now you'll see the index I was telling you about. So this is telling you that the first item has an index of 0, the second item has an index of 1, and the third item has an index of 2. Now the essence of this index is so that you are able to access all of this data within your array. Because as opposed to objects, the way you access items within your array is by the use of its index. So if I say shopping item and I want to access my first item within my shopping item list, I'm simply going to use a bracket notation and impute the index of that item. My index is 0, right? So if I do a console.log on my shopping item of index 0, if I print it out to the console and refresh, now you'd see your pepper. So if I do a console.log and say shopping item on index 1, you're going to have plantain. If I say shopping item on index 2, you're going to have what's our last? PS Vita. Let's save the changes and do a refresh. So you see we have pepper, we have plantain, and we have PS Vita. Now this is the way we access elements within our array. We access elements within arrays using their equivalent index. Now what happens when I try to access an index that does not exist? So for example, if I'm trying to access the third index, and you are sure that our index actually ends at 2, because this is 0, this is 1, and this is 2. So let's see what happens when I'm trying to access the third index in our array. Save the changes and do a refresh. Now you see that JavaScript throws an undefined error. So what JavaScript is simply telling you is that this that you're trying to access does not exist. That's what JavaScript is trying to tell you. So this is your array as a reference type. There are a lot of things to be said about array, and I've only taught you the basics. This is the basics. This is what you need to start to use your array. but I'm going to create a separate video that speaks in depthly about what an array is and all of the other things that you need to know about an array. So let's look at the last but not the least of our types, which is functions. Functions are your fundamental building blocks in JavaScript, and function is basically a piece of code that is written as a module to perform a specific function or a specific task, as the case may be. That's what a function is. One thing you should know about a function is that every function has an entry point and it also has an exit point. So how do we declare a function in JavaScript? That is very simple. You declare a function in JavaScript by using the keyword function, and this has changed. Actually, there are different ways now to declare functions in JavaScript. You can use the retro style, which is what I'm teaching you now, and you can also use what we call arrow functions. We're going to be treating that very soon. But this is the way you declare a function in JavaScript. You start by writing the keyword function, and then you type in the name of the function. Then you introduce two brackets and your curly braces. So this is where your function body exists. Right? So this is where you write the logic, which simply means what the function is supposed to do, as the task the function is supposed to execute. So we start by using our function. We had a function name, and this name can be anything. So let's say, for example, I want to write a function that adds two numbers together, and maybe I'm going ahead of myself. Another thing you should know is that functions can have inputs. Functions can have inputs. So that means you can have an input, and this is optional. Your function do not need to have an input. And this input is what we call parameter in JavaScript. So your parameter is simply the inputs that your function is expecting to perform one task or the other. And another thing you should note is that your function, I should probably write this. Another thing you should note is that your function may return a value. And the reason why I'm using may is because it's optional. It's not compulsory. Your function may return a value or not. And we'll see the different types of functions. We'll take a look at functions that do not have parameters, functions that have parameters, functions that returns values, and functions that do not return value. Let's see an example. So say we want to write a function that had two numbers together. I'll start by saying function. Now I want to name the function. I would not say add. Add is not a proper name for a function, right? So instead of that, I would say add to number. That's a proper way to name a function. Now, because I'm adding two numbers together, it is natural for you to know that this function should expect two inputs. And what are the two inputs? The two numbers that the function is adding together. So that's basically what we mean by parameters. So we can say number 1 and we can say number 2. So in this case, our function has multiple parameters. It has two parameters. Our function can also have a single parameter. So let's be done with this and we'll look at another example. So here we can easily say let results equals to number 1 plus number 2. And when we are done, we want to do a console.log on results. So what our function is basically doing here is that your function is taking whatever is passed to this parameter, whatever value is in this parameter, and is adding it with whatever value is in this parameter as well. And then we are printing out the result to the console. So now let's execute our function. Now this is not going to do anything, right? I can actually save. I can save this function and hit refresh, and you see that nothing happens. The reason why nothing happens is because when you're done writing your function does not self-execute. Functions does not self-execute. You have to invoke the function in order to execute that function. And how do we invoke a function in JavaScript? We invoke a function by basically calling the function. right? So I'll say add two numbers. When I add the brackets, you would notice that JavaScript is telling me that this function has two inputs, first number, number 1, and number 2. So that means I have to add two numbers here. So I'm saying my number 1 is 45, and I'll say my number 2 is 55. Now, this is the way you invoke a function. This is the way you invoke a function. So when we save this result, we refresh. Now you can see our results here. So what JavaScript did is JavaScript called this function and then searched for where this function is. Now it came here because this is where we declared this particular function we are invoking. Now JavaScript assigned 45 into number 1 and assigned 55 into number 2, right? So JavaScript added 45 and 55 together and saved the result, which is 100, into our variable result, and then printed out our results into our console, and that's how we have this, right? This is a particular function. We can also write a function. That contains no parameter. Say function greet. So let's say the function says, hello, how are you today? And notes that I said your functions are not self-executable. That means when you have declared your function, you have built your function, you have to invoke the function so that it can run, right? So if you save the changes and you hit refresh, you will see that nothing happens simply because we have not invoked our function. So we can go below and invoke our function. Now on invoking our function, you can do, let's save the changes and invoke our function. Okay, so we have hello, how are you today? So this is how function works in JavaScript, and this is the last reference type that we're going to be looking at. Don't forget, in summary, we looked at variables, we looked at different types of declaring a variable. We looked at let, we looked at const, we looked at the differences between let and const, and we also looked at data types. We looked at our primitive data types, we looked at our reference type data types, and we looked at our numbers, we looked at strings, we looked at booleans, we looked at null and undefined as a type of primitive data types. And we also considered objects, we considered arrays, we considered function as a type of reference data type. And this is going to be the end of this particular video. If you have not subscribed to this channel, it's a software engineering channel. If all that we do resonates with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. See you in the next video, guys. Bye bye.